were vulnerable to the fast movements of the East. Eric had already realized this while working with Allain. With the wooden sword raised above his head, Eric suddenly moved forward instead of backward, and before it landed on his head he used his own wooden sword to push the young novice backwards under the chin, sliding out of the group as he did so. As the young man crashed to the ground, Eric dodged the sword swinging at him with his body, meeting the other with his sword. A snake coiled around his throat and pulled him back with great force. "Tie him to the pole," said Baron Stenkel von Bentheim, seated on a warhorse, as he recovered his whip. Eric vaguely recognized the pole he was being dragged to. When he realized this, his eyes widened, his gaze was piercing. The two idiots who thought they were holding him tightly were about to realize their big mistake, because the cruelest, worst pains of Eric's life were the things that happened to him while he was tied to a pole. Eric could easily have killed them for what they had done, but before it came to that, a Servians, realizing that the young man would resist them, struck him again in the back of the head with the handle of a wooden sword. By this time the training ground was crowded with many knights, millets, Servians, and clarisses. They were to watch the slave tied to the pole being flogged by Baron Stenkel von Bentheim. Still unconscious, Eric's vest was removed and his tunic and shirt cut off. Most of the novices stayed where they were when the cloth was torn. The young man's back was covered with whip wounds, burn marks and the memory of battle. "What is this nonsense?" roared a loud, powerful and commanding voice. As the Grand Master entered the training field with long strides, everyone on the field turned to him and bowed their heads in salute to the Grand Master. "Sir, the indiscipline of a slave is being punished." "Is that so? What happened here, Brother Sebastian?" "Sir," Sebastian said hesitantly, looking at the Baron, "I'm afraid there was a great misunderstanding." The Grand Master had assigned Sebastian to watch Allain's slave. The young men were bitten by the warhorse, and without thinking they tried to punish them, because they were ordered to do so, he said quickly. So he summarized the situation without offending them. The young man must have thought the horse was going to hurt them, so he shouldered them and took care of the horse. The youth, thinking that a slave had attacked him, informed his superiors, who, in accordance with their training. And the Grand Master said, "You disappoint me, Valder." "I apologize, Magistra," Valder said angrily to the still unconscious Eric, then reluctantly bowed his head to the Grand Master. It was a complete misunderstanding of events. "Don't apologize, Valder. Make no mistake, we are Knights of Christ, not a bunch of Saracen thugs. If we can't control our own novices, how can we protect the pilgrims who seek refuge with us?" he said, gesturing for them to untie Eric before clasping his hands behind his back. "You are right, my lord," the Baron said. The Grand Master raised his head and addressed them all. "If power makes you cruel, then the faith of God in your heart is weak. My son, go and think about that in church." "Yes, my lord," said the Baron, as everyone on the drill field bowed their heads. By this time Sebastian had poured a bucket of water over Eric's face. Eric stood up quickly, shaking his head from side to side. He looked around more like an animal ready to fight than a man, but when he realized that no one was going to fight, he looked curiously at the old man. Remembering what Allain had told him, he clasped his hands together and bowed slightly to greet the Grand Master. "You boy, where is your master?" The young man looked at him, did not speak. The Grand Master sighed, shook his head, waved his hand at those around him and gestured for them to disperse, muttering, "He must be outside." "Sebastian," he called out. "Yes, my lord," said the young Servians. "The boy will stay in the dormitory. It is your duty to take care of him and Allain when he arrives." "Yes, my lord," said Sebastian. The Grand Master motioned for the Baron to walk with him. The Baron handed his horse to one of the junior knights and came to the Grand Master. "How was the boy?" "If we have an enemy, my lord, our loss will be great," said Baron Stenkel von Bentheim in distress. "Did you send the children on the slave, Bentheim?" "No, Magistra," said the Baron respectfully. "It was entirely spontaneous." "Bad luck," said Joseph Harriel. "Yes, Magistra," said Baron von Bentheim. "Let them not seek revenge, said the Grand Master. But they are too young, sir, and anger and pride may make our orders seem trivial to them at the moment," said Baron von Bentheim softly. He was sure the young men would beat the slave into submission in the dormitory. He did not want to prevent them. "We are the Knights Templar, Baron von Bentheim, and if we have novices who cannot obey a simple order, we should not keep them or their trainer in the center," said the Grand Master in the same soft tone. "You are quite right, Magistra," Baron von Bentheim swallowed, for the Grand Master had just threatened to banish him from the Brotherhood and from Jerusalem. The main street was crowded, everyone was looking at the street filled with city guards, but when the 4 city guards standing there rudely ordered them to move forward or not to wait, they moved on. The city guards did not allow anyone to enter the street, certainly not Bernard and the 2 men following him. For the city guard, the city of Jerusalem was divided into 4 sections: center, north, south, east and west. Each section was headed by a captain. Bernard dismounted when he saw the captain leading the western section. The captain was looking at the 2-story house in front of him with his hands on his waist, looking very bored. There were many blood stains at the entrance of the house and on the street. When the captain saw Bernard coming towards him, he nodded and took off his conical helmet and pulled back his chainmail hood. His blonde hair almost looked white. His thick, bushy mustache was turned up slightly and the beard on his chin was especially sharpened. He reached out and shook Bernard's hand, pointing to the bloodstains on the floor. 4 of my men were killed here. In the middle of the day. Bernard looked around. There were now about 40 city guards on the street. Bernard went with the captain into the 2-story house at the entrance to the west gate. Some of the city guards trying to get out had thrown colors. Inside, tables and chairs were overturned, and there were pools of blood on the floor. The captain was extremely bored to go inside the house, which, despite the light from the windows, did not seem to be illuminated. Guido Lorenzio, a Genoese, used to be a cartographer, he said, pointing to an old map on the wall. He entered the house through the back door, my lord, killed the maid and the cook, dragged the man out of bed, dragged him here and tortured him. How did your people get involved? They heard screams coming from inside the house and they broke down the door and went in. And then? The Saracens attacked them, he said, pointing to the open cellar door at the back of the hall. There were drops of blood next to the hatch. Looking at the stairs leading down, Bernard paused for a moment. I don't understand, how did the Saracens kill 4 city guards in full chainmail? Of course the city guards were not invincible, but the Saracens could not walk around the city with swords, shields, spears, bows or armor. Their daggers had to be no bigger than short swords. Without them it would not have been easy to kill 4 men in chainmail, with swords and training. Especially without paying the price of at least as many wounded or dead. I don't know, they were just Muslims using strange head bindings. How many? He asked as he descended the stairs. The cellar, dimly lit and cool compared to the outside, smelled of damp, mold and blood. Jars with tightly closed lids lined the wall. They contained mostly dried legumes, flour and the like. In a cooler, unlit corner were jugs and amphorae, which held wine and olive oil. Bernard sighed with a bored expression when he saw a chair and an old man tied to it in the center of the living room-sized space. The man had been carefully dismembered, just like Arnaldo de Payanes. Bernard looked at the bodies in front of him, 2 small children and a young woman whose throats had been slit. Bernard looked at them and at the captain who sat on the stairs as he descended. The blond man said, the Genoese's grandchildren and his daughter. One more thing, said the captain as Bernard looked at the poor children and shook his head. The young knight looked at him and said, a man in a cloak was seen coming out of here with the Saracens, a very big man. People spoke of him with fear. Afraid of what? Said Bernard. At that moment a strip of blood droplets caught his eye. He had seen it in Payane's house. Why was this strip so important? Why was it happening? Who was doing it and how? They think he was a knight, my lord. The captain said, looking at the bodies. This was what had bothered him all along, the possibility of a knight being involved. That's ridiculous, Knights wouldn't do such things, certainly not to a Christian," said Bernard with anger and conviction. "Have you heard of Titus Morgan, Captain?" Bernard asked as they climbed the stairs. "Yes, my lord." The man who had just come up the stairs hesitated for a moment, and then, after many expressions crossed his face, said, "Yes, my lord." "Do you know who he is?" The man looked around nervously. 5 or 6 years ago, I was a lieutenant. His name was very well known on the streets of Jerusalem. At first I thought he was a mercenary who had been drinking too much. My captain warned him a couple of times for excessive behavior. What had he done? He cornered and interrogated some merchants and traders, and then we started finding dead bodies in the streets. No one spoke out of fear. "But you made them talk," said Bernard. He had known this man since he was a child. He had always prioritized the safety of the streets of Jerusalem. He had been ambushed 6 times and seriously wounded 4, maybe 5 times because he would not compromise with criminals and vigilantes. But he was not only idealistic, he was actually very worldly. He was just a soldier trying to keep the streets safe for his children. There were those who spoke for honor and money. "Morgan was attacked," said the captain. "You didn't let him in?" said Bernard curiously. "Our captain at the time ordered us to turn our heads the other way. Then things got serious anyway." "How serious?" said Bernard, frowning. "Things and corpses all the way to the palace, my lord," the man said, lowering his voice. "The palace? What happened in the palace?" said Bernard. "A bunch of things," said the captain in distress. "A what?" The captain tugged at his mustache in distress. "Morgan punished the corrupt human. Then we found out that the bodies of young girls who were actually murdered were found and their families hired Morgan." "No one touched him?" "He was ordered not to be touched, my lord, and the king's counselor, the treasurer and 1 or 2 clerics from Rome were involved. If Morgan was caught and brought to trial, the story would be told and entered into my official records." "Political games, you mean?" "Yes, my lord." Bernard looked around and asked, without turning to the captain, "And do you think he was right?" "Morgan?" "Yes. There is a fine line between justice and revenge, Sir de Sonnac, and Morgan never crossed it. If he had, it would have disturbed not only his sleep, but the sleep of every man in a blue tunic who was on the streets at the time, serving in good conscience and not just for his salary." Once in the dimly lit corridors, Eric calmly removed his torn shirt and tunic. It was as if there were no layers of fat on his body. There were too many scars to count on the muscles that looked like fibers. Sebastian looked at him timidly and said, "Well, if you don't do what the Grand Master says when he orders you, you will be expelled." Eric looked at the young Servientes curiously, not understanding what he meant. He was a slave after all, he was not a member of the Brotherhood. Why was he? Oh, what a fool, Sebastian was talking about him. He was thinking. When Sebastian said, "He asked me to follow you," he was probably worried that something like this might happen. Then he looked around and smiled wider, with an optimism that could not be underestimated. "They're not really bad kids. I mean, usually?" And when he saw Eric looking at him and raising one eyebrow, he said, No, they don't mess with me, because they don't see me. Nobles don't see servients," he said with a charming smile. Eric turned his head and looked down the corridor they were traveling down. On both sides of the corridor hung models of heavy wooden swords, spears, mallets, war hammers and other weapons, ready for training. "Ah yes, they are noble-born? God made them privileged to rule the land and the people," Sebastian said, believing what he was saying. At that moment Eric looked at his hand, his vision changed for a moment, the corridor turned to ashes and dust. Eric's hand was covered in blood. That blood belonged to a prince. He was in a burning palace, surrounded by guards, with concubines screaming and running in all directions, and on his hand was the blood of a prince. Noble or not, they were bleeding. And anything that bled could die. Eric shook his head. These memories should be in the past, not remembered. Opening and closing his hand, Sebastian said, "No, I am not noble. I'm the sixth son of a common peasant family. The best I can hope for is an abbot in the clerisses or a clerk in the servience." Eric just looked at him and nodded. Sebastian decided to change the subject. "I watched you in the field and you were very good. I would love to fight like that." Eric didn't react. The two newbie knights looked at them indifferently and kept walking. They were dressed in chainmail, over which they wore white tunics and carried swords, which they proudly tied around their belts. "How arrogant they are," thought Eric. "Did you learn to fight from Master Allain?" Sebastian asked. Eric shook his head from side to side. "Not to fight, but to survive," thought Eric, shaking his hand and opening it. Survive. That was all Eric knew, to survive. "Don't you have anyone other than Master Allain? No family?" Sebastian asked. Eric shook his head again. When the Persians had come and raided his house, his father had made them pay dearly for it, but they hadn't treated him fairly. He had shot him with an arrow, over and over, until he was a porcupine. Eric had watched his mother get raped and kill herself, and he and his brothers had sold her to slavers. The young man shook his head from side to side. He had watched his brothers die. He no longer had any relatives. "I'm so sorry," Sebastian said. "But where did you learn to fight?" Eric looked at Sebastian and pointed to his wrists and neck. Looking at the calloused scars there, Sebastian at first didn't understand anything, then his eyes widened and he said, "You learned as a slave." "I understand." He showed her the symbols of the shackles that had been used on her wrists when she was a slave and the symbols of her masters who had branded her. When he was bought, the symbol of his master was stamped on his back with a hot iron. The Mongols had thrown him in a pit after caging him for months. If he won the fight, they threw him a dry loaf of bread, maybe some moldy dried meat if they were in the mood, or a mostly eaten bone, into the filthy mud. If he didn't win, he was in no condition to get up anyway, but he would wait until the morning or the next day to whip him. Over time he learned to fight, his value increased as he started to win in the pit, and as his value increased, his owners changed, and as his owners changed, the symbols on his back changed. Each owner found a new torture for him. With each owner he learned new opponents, new weapons, new ways of fighting. They fed him better, trained him better because he was a good earner. One owner taught him to wrestle like a Mongol, one taught him Persian daggers, one taught him what the Chinese call the art of war. Sebastian smiled and led him into a large hall, marked 19 at the entrance. The hall they entered was a dormitory, with tall arched windows opposite them, and behind the window a wall of oleanders and olive trees growing tall. Opposite them, chain mail and drill shields leaned against a table, and to their right were bunk beds. "Can you sleep here?" she asked, pointing to one of the bunks made of thick wood. Eric shook his head, thinking he was cold. In fact, he was just buried in memories he didn't want to remember. Eric shook his head as he remembered lying on the ground in the cold meadows, tied to a cart with an iron ring around his neck and a chain attached to the ring. He shivered uncontrollably, shoving his hands under his armpits as meters of steam rose from his mouth. When the two men in the cage had contracted the plague, the Mongols had burned them alive and chained the rest to the cart and made them walk alongside it. He shivered all night long. He never slept in a bed after that. "You wait here," Sebastian said, looking at Eric's torn clothes, and Eric sat on the bed. Sebastian walked away quickly, and Eric tensed as he lay on the soft bed, as if he had fallen into a swamp and was sinking into it. The feeling bothered him so much that he remembered the moment when one of his masters had taken him to the city and thrown him into a shithole. He opened his eyes in distress. A short while later Sebastian came back with a folded shirt, a tunic and a vest, but Eric was gone. "Oh dear," said Sebastian, thinking that the young man had run away. Then he saw the shadow next to the bed. He slowly moved forward and looked and saw Eric lying in the space between the bunks. With a sad expression Sebastian dropped the clothes he had brought on the bed, sat on the edge of a diagonal bed and waited for the young man to wake up. Allain entered St. Peter's Square. St. Peter was one of Jesus' disciples and an early leader of Christianity. In the center of the small square, connected by 5 main roads, was a small statue of a man believed to be Street Peter. On a small platform to the north of the statue was a thin man with long hair and a long goatee, tied by the neck and wrist to a wooden platform. A young city guard stood guard over him, amusing himself by throwing rotten fruit and vegetables from the market to the west of the square. Allain smiled at the sight of the man, turned away, opened his hand slightly and showed the city guard the ring he had turned inside out. The young man straightened his posture as if he were standing guard at the Holy Sepulchre. Lucien, Allain said, putting one foot up and resting his elbows on his leg. The man in the pillory barely turned his head to see who was addressing him, and when he finally saw Allain de Bures, he said, "My dear friend Sir Allain, what a pleasure it is to see you, my lord." In his usual fawning, cheerful tone. "What are you doing here, Lucien?" asked Allain with a smile, but he was sure that this miserable-looking man in his late 30s deserved every bit of the punishment he was receiving. This yoke was usually reserved for those who knowingly and willfully distorted price practices in trade or for simple swindlers. "It's a total misunderstanding," he said, reaching up to his face with his hand, trying to brush the dirty hair out of his face. But when that didn't work, he gave up in despair. Allain looked at the young city guard, who was in charge of completing the sentence, and who was also waiting to make sure that no one went too far. "Fraud, my lord," the young man said respectfully. "An old man mistook me for someone else," said Lucien in a very convincing voice. "Is that so?" said Allain, amused. "What did he sell the poor man?" asked Allain. "The nails that Jesus used on the cross," said Lucien, spreading his hands helplessly. Allain was surprised. In fact, the judge or the commander of the guard would have given Lucien at least 50 lashes. "It's a good thing you didn't sell any goblets this time," he said. When he had first met her, she had tried to sell him a wooden chalice as the cup from which Jesus drank the last wine. "No selling. I am just a victim in this astonishing and unfortunate case that people should take a lesson from. I naively showed this man the nails that were sold to me and asked him, could it be this one, they look so old? He bought them from me for less than the price I paid and said I had been swindled, that he was doing me a favor. Then his friends and relatives intervened and made him believe that he had been swindled. In the end, I was swindled, my lord," he said, pitying himself perfectly. Lucien was a master of the con, and it was from this man that Allain had learned the real essence of the con. People always thought that con men forced their victims to say, "Come here, I'll con you and you'll give me what I want." But the truth was the opposite. It was usually the cunning ones who thought they were exploiting the weakness or helplessness of the scammer. The scammer would tell them that he was desperate to sell them something fake, that he was overpriced for what he had, and that he needed the low price now. The cunning ones would attack his desperation. They thought they had swindled this weak man, whose daughter or wife was hungry or sick, out of 2 pieces of silver for something that was actually worth 100 pieces of silver. No one in these stories would help the hungry for nothing. Allain took a silver coin out of his belt, turned it over in his fingers, twirling his hand with great dexterity, and the silver coins became 2. Lucien's attention was completely focused on him. "I'm looking for Michael Richardson," Allain said. "I last heard he was in Cyprus, my lord," Lucien said quickly. 2 silvers. He had fallen into this yoke for 1 silver. Michael Richardson of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. He was one of the Black Robe's most troublesome swordsmen. Lucien didn't even want to be in the same neighborhood with him, let alone find him. "But 2 pieces of silver. If you find out where he is," said Allain. Lucien nodded, "But there may be costs, my lord." And another silver coin appeared between Allain's fingers. "I will let you know, as always, my lord," Lucien said, grinning through his yellow teeth. "And the king of the underworld?" said Allain. Lucien's grin disappeared. "What about him? Is he still there?" "I'm afraid, my lord," he said, completely out of spirits. Meanwhile, one of the boys who had just bought ammunition at the market managed to hit Lucien in the head with a rotten tomato. Allain smiled and walked away. Bernard tapped his short whip lazily against his leg in boredom, staring boredly at a mule-drawn cart on the cobbled streets. Behind him, the city guards were asking door to door, shop to shop, about the fleeing Saracens. They were piecing together brief accounts from people who had seen them, trying to figure out where the men had gone. Bernard shook his head, making a high-pitched sound through his teeth. It still wasn't sinking in. What did a group of Saracens and whoever the vagabonds were who traveled with them want with an old cartographer and knight? What was the connection between Arnaldo de Paines and Guido Lorenzio? Why did they do such a thing in the middle of the day? Meanwhile a cat stormed past, followed by 4 dogs, who were clearly enjoying themselves. Bernard watched the cat leap onto the barrels and then onto a roof and shook his head from side to side. At the end of the street he could see the south gate. He squinted, remembering them when everyone talked about the strange-looking Saracens, bearded and too dark. They were dressed in orange, burgundy and green, and if everyone who asked remembered them, how had the city guards at the gate not seen them enter the city this morning? As he thought this, he could hear the city guards behind him approaching him. The men were talking politely to the people, as he had ordered them. Bernard smiled. Maybe they could turn Jerusalem into a city that people would dream of and envy. They could be like Constantinople or Athens. As Bernard smiled, imagining this, he heard a scream. The high-pitched, rasping sound was heard by the men, coming from an alley to their right. Bernard and the 4 city guards behind him dived into that alley, and as they ran down the short street they were joined by 4 city guards doing the same in the next alley. There were 10 of them when they saw a woman, still screaming, pointing them down an alley. Bernard heard the men behind him draw their swords, but he felt no need to do so. He had learned, as Paines had trained him, to use his head above all else. There was no need to draw a sword if the woman could just stand there and shout. When he reached the entrance to the street, he saw 3 dead men in the narrow alleyway. 3 men dressed in orange, burgundy and navy blue, extremely dark and with long black beards. In their hands were large, curved daggers. He could tell they had died in combat. The walls and floor were covered in blood. When it started to get crowded, he sent 2 city guards to where he was and 2 other men to the other end of the alley. Knock on every door in this neighborhood, see if anyone recognizes these men, he said as he entered the alley. Meanwhile, a tall dark-haired man was watching him from the crowd, one hand in his cassock. The sweaty man looked down at his hand, covered in his own blood, trembling as he left the crowd of curious onlookers. He looked around under his hood, tired and uneasy, and slowly walked away. People were so focused on the woman who had made a dramatic spectacle for her neighbors by seeing the bodies in the alley and screaming, that no one noticed the burly man. After crossing St. Peter's Square, Allain entered Uzun Snar Street and then Jade Bush Street. Here, after the first shop on the corner, he looked at the signboard and smiled. The sign, its old paint peeling and rivets rusted, read The One-Eyed Man. They had turned an old house into an inn. In a country of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, muttered Allain and entered the inn. The shutters of the dimly lit inn were open and servants were sweeping the floor. Although it had been aired and cleaned, there was an odor of beer and wine. Street Osman, he called out to the tall, white-haired, one-eyed man cleaning what he hoped were washed mugs on the long table in front of the inn kitchen. The man, one eye white, the other dark brown, looked at the large man approaching him from under his thick eyebrows and grinned. "Kaffir," he said, spreading his thick arms in glee. "Saracen," said Allain, also opening his arms. "I'm sorry you weren't killed," Osman said as the 2 men embraced in the center of the inn, looking exuberant in their own way and reluctant from a distance. "I'm glad you're alive," Allain replied. "May your fingers curl backwards and may you never taste wine again," Osman said as he showed him to a nearby table. "May life give you everything you wish for," said Allain as he sat down at the table. "How long has it been?" he asked as he came back with the mugs he had just dried and a jug of wine from the back. 6.5 years, said Allain, pouring the wine. "You should take longer trips," said Osman, tapping his mug against Allain's. "You may be right, I still haven't forgotten your ugly face," Allain said with a smile. He looked around, almost nothing had changed: the fireplace in which stew had been cooking for days, the tables, the pennant on the wall and the small carpets. It was as if the inn was a place free of time, as if days, months, seasons did not pass here. "Can I get you a room?" Osman asked. "For two," said Allain, pulling a gold coin from his belt and tapping it with his thumb so that it tinkled and spun in the air. Catching the coin in mid-air, Osman bit into it and tucked it into his belt. "Where is the second person?" he asked. "In the temple," Allain said as he nodded somewhere, though he wasn't sure which way the temple was pointing, but it didn't matter. "They haven't kicked you out yet?" Osman said, laughing and drinking his wine. "Give them time until tomorrow," said Allain with a smile. "What do I need to know?" Osman checked his surroundings. "Sarah, be a good girl and bring us some lamb rolls from the corner," he said to one of